The next task that's very common for managing Azure Active Directory is managing domain names and then looking at multiple directories or multiple tenants. So first of all, you can have multiple Azure Active Directory domains within a subscription. Every subscription at a minimum has one, but you can have additional domains within a subscription. Whenever you create a subscription, a default domain is created for you, and it's always got the prefix on Microsoft.com. So when you have a user account, it's always user at whatever you name your domain. So let's say I name my domain Contoso Blue, so user at contosoblue.onmicrosoft.com. You can customize that by adding a publicly routable domain. It's sometimes what's referred to as a vanity domain. So that instead of being contosoblue.onmicrosoft.com, it can be user at contosoblue.com. And users can leverage the domain name they're familiar with when they authenticate. The most common use case for this is, you want the user logon name to match the email address. I log on as Corey@hindsight.biz everywhere because I've configured my Azure Active Directory tenant to match my public domain name, which matches my email address. And that's by far the most common way that this is done. So to do this, number one, you've got to be a global administrator. Anyone that creates the subscription that contains the directory is the default global admin. And then you have to be able to demonstrate ownership of the domain that you want to configure. So for example, if I want to be, admin at contosoblue.com, I have to demonstrate that I in fact own contosoblue.com. Now the way that's done is by demonstrating you have administrative access to the DNS. So it doesn't check actual ownership. If you have administrative access to manipulate the DNS records for contosoblue.com, that's considered acceptable, and it considers that you own it, and it will actually begin to use that domain name. Now, the way that ownership is demonstrated is you have to have permission within that domain to add a special text record. So when you register that domain within Azure, they give you something that looks just like this. You have a text record. In this case, it's ms equals ms156283334. And it wants me to create that record in my domain. So I create that in contosoblue.com. Azure will then query for that DNS record. If it finds it, it means I could create it, which in Azure's mind means that I own it. And so now it will switch the name of the domain from contosoblue.onmicrosoft.com to my actual name I want to have, which is contosoblue.com. Azure tenants, which is a term, so a lot of people get this term confused. A tenant is a dedicated instance of Azure Active Directory. A lot of people, especially when they're new to Azure, they confuse subscription tenant directory. And a lot of people incorrectly associate the notion of a subscription with a tenant. A subscription is essentially a credit card definition that lets you pay for something. A tenant is an instance of Azure Active Directory. So for example, contosoblue.onmicrosoft.com is an example of a tenant. contosored.onmicrosoft.com is an example of a tenant. So it's an instance of Azure Active Directory. You can have multiple tenants within your organization. And these different tenants can have different functions. For example, maybe one is for testing. Maybe one is for production use. Maybe one is for Office 365, another is for Intune. So you can have multiple tenants. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. Each one is completely isolated, completely separate set of policies, completely separate set of user accounts, groups, roles, actions, completely different directories. Adding and managing these is actually very, very simple. You can create a new instance of Azure Active Directory at any time. Here's where things get a little bit tricky if you do this for the first time. While you can create a new directory, you can't create new objects in that directory until you associate it with a subscription. So the typical process is you create a new directory, you then create an admin account for that directory, and that admin will associate a subscription with that directory. Every single directory needs to have at least one subscription associated with it. They're not automatically child resources of that existing subscription. Why would you have multiple directories? Well, you want independent resources, you want different administrators, or you have multiple domains you want to synchronize differently. There's all kinds of reasons that you might want to do this. So, some examples. separate production, test, and development. To have a separate set of user accounts as guests. That, I want them to have an account in my guest directory and then periodically grant those users access to my production directory. I want to have multiple cloud services. Now, creating it is simply a matter of going into the marketplace, creating a new instance of Azure Active Directory. Deleting it is a little more involved. Deleting it, you've number one got to remove all users, all applications, all associations with cloud services, all links to multi-factor providers, and then have one user use a guest user as an admin role. So that means I've got to add a user from an external directory, log on as that user in the external directory, connect to the directory I want to delete, and then delete it. When you delete one of these directories, it will run through this checklist and tell you what you've missed. Having deleted a number of these directories over the years, it can be a fairly involved process to get all those. They seem like a simple little list, but it can be a fairly involved process to meet those requirements to actually get that directory deleted. So that's a look at some of the tasks that are involved in managing Azure Active Directory.